Hello, I'm Eric Snodgrass, and thank you for watching today's Ag Forecast brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions, your premier platform for real-time global insights. Well, yesterday's geostationary satellite data here from GOES 16 gave us a lot to look at, including Tropical Storm Isaias, which will be moving over the next 24 hours toward the Carolina coast. Meanwhile, a much deeper trough swept through the Midwest and through the Great Lakes states, and we did get some convection, some storms popping on the heat of the afternoon there, but still, it was a much cooler weekend after this deeper trough slid through. But the western part of the United States had a very interesting pattern that established, and I want to show you a picture that was sent to me by Danielle. She's here in Washington, and she says, this is an odd cloud formation. Do you know what's causing this? And you can see it in the picture, a very long but narrow and high cloud. Well, I want to show you what this looked like on satellite. We talked at the end of last week about a deep upper level low that was coming out of the Gulf of Alaska toward the Pacific Northwest, and it was going to be something that was going to finally cool things down after a very, very hot week last week. Well, the cloud feature she's talking about is right here, this feature in through this region. And what was going on here was way out ahead of the upper level circulation that was this low, there was a narrow band of vorticity, that's spin in the atmosphere, a cyclonic spin or counterclockwise spin. And out ahead of that, we find that counterclockwise spin causes the atmosphere to rise. So we get lifting motion in the atmosphere that gives us cooling and condensation and produces that long, narrow kind of filament of cloud. So fantastic question, great picture, and I'm glad we got to see it both here with the data and also with our satellite imagery. Now, what's interesting about this pattern is that we keep seeing troughs that sweep through the Pacific Northwest. And to be honest, if we were going to fear a pattern in the western United States which led to a lot of fires, we would be more worried about huge ridges that were going through the Pacific Northwest that curled around into what that we call that high over low pattern, where there's a big high here and a low there. Well, I'm going to take that off there. We don't have that setup, yet still we're dealing with some pretty sizable fires in California. But what's interesting about it is notice the direction that the smoke is blowing. So instead of having strong Santa Ana winds blow the smoke here across, for example, the LA basin, the Apple Fire, which you see there, which spread smoke across Southern California over into Arizona yesterday, which is a massive fire, you can see that the wind direction is out of the west toward the east. There are other fires that are right now going in parts of Northern California as well, and it's that time of year that we have to be watching for this fire activity very, very carefully. But I would like to show you a picture here caught by a tower cam looking here at how large that fire is, and also showing you some of the pyrocumulus on top of it. Still a very impressive thing to be seeing here, but certainly degrading the air quality, and it's going to be a fire that's going to be difficult to contain. On the other side of the country, we watched in the overnight hours with our mosaic radar image here what was Tropical Storm Isaias. Now, had a pretty well-defined circulation, but it did skirt along the coast of Florida, did not make landfall. And in the overnight hours, it stayed a pretty strong tropical storm. But what we're watching very carefully early this morning is this satellite animation. And we can see that just as we were watching the sunrise here in the eastern part of the United States, we saw some pretty deep convection here happening in the core of Isaias. And there's not a lot standing in the way of this system to continue to possibly strengthen a little bit before it makes landfall in the Carolinas and perhaps right along the North and South Carolina border. We saw the latest update here, 5 a.m. update Eastern Time from the National Hurricane Center, also suggesting that this does become a Category 1 hurricane. It only needs to gain another 4 miles an hour in wind speed in order to become a hurricane. And we've just posted hurricane warnings for the South Carolina-North Carolina border there, which you can see in red. So this system will be then moving through parts of the mid-Atlantic and up toward the northeast and along its way, putting down some very, very heavy precipitation. You can see the European model's guidance here. It takes it right along that I-95 corridor after making landfall somewhere here late tonight, early tomorrow morning along the North Carolina-South Carolina border. The GFS picks a similar path, a little bit different view here, but a very similar path. But you can see the extended view of this taking it way out here into the open North Atlantic Ocean as we work our way out deep into the end of this week and next week. Now, when I tell you that there's not a lot standing in its way, a couple of things we would be concerned about is if there was very low humidity ahead of this or also a lot of wind wind shear? Well, the first map addresses the humidity question. We can see with Isaias currently sitting here that the nearest dry air is pretty far to the east. And if this dry air were cutting around the northern edge of this or getting ingested into the system, then we would possibly see a weakening of Isaias, but we don't. We see it pretty far over here to the east, maybe not playing that great of a role as Isaias makes its way due north right now. In terms of wind shear, this is a map that shows you wind shear, and again, wind shear is just change in wind speed and direction with height. What I want you to remember is that hurricanes thrive in low wind shear environments. In other words, they do well when the environment around them is calm. They spin violently themselves, but they need to spin in an environment that doesn't have a lot of wind shear. Wind shear tears apart the vortex and spreads out the heating and weakens the system. Well, the high wind shear right now is in this area where we have our deep trough that swept through the Midwest. What's ahead of Isaias, which is right in this area going toward North Carolina, there is some high bulk shear values in here, but it is not nearly to the extent of what's over parts of Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. So while the wind shear is not ideal out ahead of this, it will likely prevent it from becoming much, much stronger. There is pretty good evidence that this system will continue to strengthen, possibly back into a Category 1 strength storm as it moves toward the North and South Carolina border. Over the next 4 days, this is total accumulated precipitation from the European model. Pretty widespread 1 to 3 inches of rainfall with an inner core there that's going to stretch from the border of North and South Carolina clear up into parts of New York where we could be seeing upwards of 4 inches of rainfall under some of the heaviest rain bands. The GFS model agrees with this pretty well, and you can see here this is its take on how much precipitation to anticipate. So some very heavy rainfall coming to some places that need it, but the question is, will the winds be too strong such that the rain plus the winds really degrades the stand quality of the crop? So let's take a look at those winds. The GFS right now shows a pretty widespread over the next few days, gusts between 40 and 60 miles an hour along the coast here of North and South Carolina, but that then stretches all the way up to New York City, even toward Boston. The European model has a bit stronger wind field being resolved here. We do see gusts at times getting up close to 80 miles an hour. So the European model showing a much more vigorous system as it moves onshore here. And my concern again would be with the standability of the crop that's in this area, given what we've seen so far this year with some very wet conditions early and then dry conditions as of late, especially in parts of North Carolina. We'll have to see how much these strong winds plus these rains, what kind of damage they possibly do to the crop. Just to give you one more perspective, this is from the National Digital Forecast Database. So again, this is coming from the National Weather Service here. And we can see that they are also calling for 40 to 70 mile an hour wind gusts over the next couple of days as Isaias comes through. So we can expect strong tropical storm strength winds, sometimes approaching hurricane strength with the gusts, okay? Outside of that, let's take a look at what we got over the last 72 hours. The European model handled the low over the weekend very well that went tracking in through this area. Brought quite a bit of rainfall to sections of the eastern Corn Belt and parts of the Mid-South. Outside of that, you can see the northwest flow that came through here, basically from Idaho all the way to Texas, and some widely scattered storms on that as well. And some relatively heavy rainfall out of a few storms that went through parts of the Delta here. Well, putting this in perspective, over the last 14 days, and these data are valid through yesterday morning, we start to pick out some of the really dry spots and the really wet spots. One of the really dry areas is right in through here, stretching from South Dakota through Iowa, southern Minnesota, northern Illinois, then getting into parts of southern Wisconsin. That particular region over the last couple of weeks has missed out on the rainfall that's really gone just to its south and through here where it's been quite heavy. Hit or miss storms across parts of the south and southeast, and same thing for parts of Texas here. So as we go forward in this forecast, we're going to be seeing some pretty heavy rain put down in places that have been very dry. And I'm specifically talking about where Isaias will be going through drier fields in North Carolina and then eventually up here into the northeast, which earlier this year had been struggling with drought. So with that in the background, let's take a look at this forecast for the next 7 days of total accumulated precipitation from the National Weather Service here. So what we get is relatively quieter conditions across the midsection of the United States. We have a few systems to be watching, but relatively quiet. The main show is, of course, going to be Isaias as it moves through here, the eastern part of the United States. Now, to understand that, I want you to watch the flow of the upper levels of the atmosphere. We're going to pay attention to, as we watch this again, three main areas. One will be the eastern United States, the second will be over Alaska, and the third will be here over Scandinavia. So as we step back, we can see that the deeper trough that is in place here will stick around through much of this week, keeping things cooler but relatively drier compared to recently across this area. It looks like that'll stick around Thursday in through Friday, and it may not be until the weekend before we start to see a rebound in temperatures here as the pattern begins to adjust. Now, what's going to cause the pattern to adjust are the other two features. The deeper troughs that keep forming here over Alaska, sending cooler air into the Pacific Northwest, and the downstream ridging that's happening over Scandinavia. This seems to be here for longer than 10 days. So this high over low setup, see the high here and the low there? That block is something I'm going to have to watch carefully. Now, why the North Pacific maintains this deeper trough here is likely due to the heat in the ocean that's between Hawaii and Alaska and the cooler waters that are just naturally here in this part of the Arctic. We're keeping very strong winds that keep sweeping through here, which is keeping the momentum high in the North Pacific. But what this is doing is it keeps pulling troughs into the Northwest, like the one that you see here. So as I take you all the way out 10 days from now, which goes all the way into the middle of next week, we see the atmosphere settling back into a pattern where it puts a trough in the northwest, a ridge somewhere over the Four Corners states. We get a little bit of northwest flow in through this area, but this big downstream ridge here is the thing that I'm having to call into question as to its position and strength. Now, why we bring all of this up is because, remember, in last week's long range, I called into question the longevity of the cooler weather in the middle part of the United States. I said, well, we have yet to get locked into a pattern where there's blocking in the North Pacific, and therefore we kept shoving troughs into the Northwest. That resulted in heat that rebounded in the middle part of the country, and it seems to be that is the case. So that mid-August cool down doesn't look to still be there in the long-range forecast. Certainly something we're going to be discussing this week. So let's get into some of the details here. Over the next 3 days, we're going to watch the high plains for our chances for severe weather. You can see all across the top there, day 1, 2, and 3, the high plains certainly going to be dealing with some strong to severe storms. We have the influence of Isaias in day 1 and day 2 going up the east coast. But as we work our way toward the end of the week for Thursday evening and Friday evening, I want to watch this general corridor in through here and this part of the Canadian prairies for the chances for storms on Thursday night. On Friday, as we see this next low come out, we're going to keep a close eye here in parts of Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and then also a general area down here that we're going to watch for scattered storms, some of which could be stronger. All right. From there, let's just get an idea about what that looks like by going straight to the European model. So playing this forward, let's pause it right there, bring you back, and let's see where Isaias goes again. So the deeper trough that's sweeping through the midsection of the country, still some scattered light rain out ahead of it here throughout the day on Monday. We will see then possibly Hurricane Isaias hitting right here on the border. This will be happening right around midnight tonight. And as this pulls through North Carolina quickly, gets through Virginia and then toward Pennsylvania by Tuesday evening, that's a pretty quick moving system. So that's why the rainfall amounts are generally less than 6 inches. It's a pretty quick moving system through parts of the Carolinas and Virginia. At this particular point on Tuesday evening, very strong winds in and around New York City. Meanwhile, higher pressure on the back side of it, but we do see, here it is, Tuesday evening, the chances for storms still here along the high plains getting up into the northern plains of the United States. Wednesday morning, Wednesday afternoon, and evening. Remember, this is going to be where we're going to watch again later this week for the chances of storms in this area. So as we go from there into Thursday morning, afternoon, and evening, we're going to keep an eye. Let me step you back to Thursday evening. We're going to keep an eye in this whole area for some chances for some showers and storms. I know there's higher pressure in this area, but we're going to keep an eye on its periphery for some stronger storms, okay? Meanwhile, you can see over here, mid-Atlantic, parts of the Carolinas, pop-up storms again toward the end of this week. As we work our way into Friday morning, afternoon, and evening, our next low starts to emerge here in the basically out of parts of British Columbia into Saskatchewan. And as the deeper trough pulls in, remember that's where we're going to watch this whole quarter at the end of the week for some chances for some storms on Friday. Working our way into the weekend, we see that frontal boundary slides farther to the east, maybe some rainfall, scattered rain that comes into parts of Iowa. We need to watch this all week because as you saw, this was a drier area. So this would be Saturday morning. As we work our way through Saturday afternoon and evening, we see better chances for some showers and storms in this area as the pattern adjusts. Now, what is that pattern adjustment? It's one where we get by day 10 having a trough in the GFS here, in the European there, ridging down to the south here. And so the flow's coming generally like this, and then it could crash over the top like it's suggesting here in the European on the right. And that particular flow pattern gives us this. So week 2 precipitation anomalies from the GFS on the left, European on the right. You can see stormy conditions through this corridor in both of the models. With the ridge establishing itself here, we're slowing down the monsoon, we're slowing down the convection over the southwest as the flow generally just pulls around that high. Now, please understand, we will still get scattered storms all in this area as it runs around this ridge, but there will be no large low pressure systems moving through there, which is why we see things drier than normal as we press this out into week 2. From there, I want to talk about temperatures. We are certainly going to have a cool one in the midsection of the country today with heat west where that ridge is, but notice the trough swept through for Monday, taking things back to normal here in the Pacific Northwest, while we have a lot of mid to upper 90s here in the Central Valley of California. Playing this forward, let's see how things change for Tuesday. You're going to see that trough in the midsection of the country hangs around Tuesday. It's there until Wednesday and Thursday as well. Now at this particular point, we see the broader troughing coming in the west, and look at the cool down the west is going to be getting by the time we get into Thursday. So really the only places across the country that stay hot are down in the desert southwest over toward western Texas. By the time we get into Friday though, and then Saturday, we start to see at the end of this week quite a bit of heat pulling into the midsection of the country here as this next ridge really starts to establish itself right in through this area. We can see that better when we go out here to the 6 to 10 day time period. The ridging that's happening over the western United States sends the above average temperatures in this direction, while cooler weather comes into the Pacific Northwest. We can see it in both models. The warmth spreads again into this region, while the cool down happens in the Pacific Northwest. And that tends to stick around all the way through day 11 through 15. See the cooler weather here in the Northwest with heat stretching on the eastern side of that. Now, a few things I'll be discussing this week in the long range. We've seen the Southern Oscillation peak out just below La Nina threshold. The MJO is trying to go back to Africa, so it's trying to get back into this broad standing wave over Africa. And we're going to talk about what's going on with that North Pacific momentum and what that means in terms of blocking over Scandinavia. So we'll get into all that. But to finish this up, I want to give you an international perspective on the weather. That block over Scandinavia is part of the reason why we see much drier conditions throughout most of Europe's growing area. And we took a look last week at where we have soil moisture problems here. But you can see that as the temperatures really rebound over parts of Ukraine, for example, we're going to be seeing much drier conditions over the next 15 days. Outside of that, I want to take you to China here very quickly because we do have a tropical system we're going to be watching that you can see by the tracks here is going to be bringing this onshore very close to Shanghai. Now, why we need to discuss that is because of where all of this flooding has been taking place. So the Three Gorges Dam is right here on the Yangtze River, and what we notice is that upstream of that, so in the watershed, over the next 10 days, very wet conditions, also north of it as well. And then we can see the influence of the tropical system cutting right through here, bringing some rain to basically where the delta is near Shanghai. On the North China Plain, we do see quite a bit of heavy precipitation over this week as well, including there in the Korean Peninsula too. So very wet throughout this region over in China. Lastly, I want to bring up one important point that we're going to be looking a lot at, our La Nina. Okay, so it's here. It's weak at best, but we've seen quite a bit of cooler water emerge in Nino region 1-2. Now, why that's significant is because if you look at the correlation for September and October with Nino region 1-2 ocean temperatures and rainfall rate, we see that the warmer those ocean temperatures are, the higher the rainfall rate is in this area. Well, they're not warm right now, they're cold, which means we would expect in this area lower than average rainfall rate. Right now, we're already dealing with very dry conditions during the dry season here. And as we look at the GRACE satellite-based root zone soil moisture, there is considerable concern over longer-term drought developing here in Brazil's main growing areas. And on top of that, I was just looking at some data suggesting where there are already a lot of fires going right now in South America. And we can see here from satellite, right in central Brazil here, a lot of fires blowing up on the pasture land. And you can see some of these fires are quite extensive, and they went not only from Mato Grosso do Sul, but clear into Paraguay and down into Argentina as well. So a lot of fire activity that we're going to have to start watching here. And finally, we are seeing some fires that are in the Amazon as well. Sentinel, a satellite based out of Europe, caught some fires here with very high resolution imagery in parts of the Amazon. So what I want you to think about with this, I'm just going to go back a couple images, is as we start to think about the upcoming planting season for South America, remember, they won't get that crop going until they start to see the rains returning. So this could be something that might delay the planting of soybeans in South America. Let's just watch it together and keep a close eye on things. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up right there. I really want to encourage you to visit my.nutrienagsolutions.com. Go there and check out all of our regional content plus our long-range video coming out on Wednesday, all right? Talk to you again very soon. Have a great week. Thank you.